Hi there, I'm Kat. Today we are going to talk about shame, guilt, and attribution error. So I'm going to be painting, I'll be looking kind of back and forth, mainly kind of concentrating on what I'm doing, but I'll be talking at the same time. I find that painting kind of relaxes me, and I think sometimes, well, a lot of the time, especially when I watch YouTube videos, I'm doing other things or when I'm listening to audiobooks, right? And so the better I can relay information clearly, I think that's what's important. And also, when we're talking about things like shame, guilt, and attribution error, we're talking about processes and feelings, emotions, things that we are holding inside. And so I think that, I know that weighs on us. And so if you are so inclined, I really do invite you to grab an easel or a canvas, or an easel and a canvas, or notebook paper or something, doodle, sketch, whatever. Bring up Adobe, bake. I like to bake sometimes. I stress bake. But try to do something creative or movement oriented when you're listening to things that have to do with emotions. Anyway, so just a little bit of background. My name's Kat. I have a bachelor's in psychology, a bachelor's in metaphysics, a master's in law enforcement and justice administration. I concentrate on social bond theory. I'm working on my PhD in psychology with an emphasis on media and technology. And I'm a certified personal trainer, group fitness instructor, nutrition coach. I'm working on yoga instructor and meditation. I am certified in meditation instructing. So my whole focus over the last probably over the last decade, has been just trying to understand this thing we call existence. So I'm going to get into painting while I'm talking, because we're going to get into the bulk of today's actual discussion. So first, let's start off with what is attribution error, because I think when I say shame and guilt, most people kind of know what those things are, or at least they know how they feel inside when they experience something like shame or guilt. But attribution error is a psychological term that isn't as widely talked about as it probably should be. There's a lot of pop psychology out there, so we end up talking about or using words like narcissist and ego and trauma and all of that. And yet attribution error has not really made it into the common vernacular yet, which is interesting. So, what is an attribution error? Now that there's been such a lead-in. So, an attribution error is when we talk to someone or interact with someone and we attribute their behavior as a part of their personality, instead of being able to see it as situational. So this can be positive and negative, and it doesn't even have to be, and this is why I'm tying it to guilt and shame in this episode, or this video. It doesn't have to be that it's someone else that we're having this attribution error with. We can have it with ourselves. So, I'll give you an example of how this will play out. And I think that it commonly happens either in work or in personal life. So at work, it could play out where your boss is really stressed, or let's say you're really stressed. You've got 1,000 things going on. And you've got an employee review that you have to fill out, and maybe you mark an employee kind of low because you're stressed, because you feel unsupported, because all of this stuff is going on. And then the employee looks at, or you're the employee and you go in to sit in with your boss and they give you your report and it shows that there's a lot of room for improvement. And you're reading it and you're going, this doesn't seem correct, right? It could, and maybe it doesn't even seem like that's really your boss's normal way of being, okay? And then you talk to your boss, and I know this is a lot of and thens, this is a complicated, I mean, in the workplace, I think it happens so frequently, honestly, where we have meetings with people and maybe it's just not the right day to have that meeting and someone says something and it's that foot and mouth, but it comes off really bad. And really maybe that, or someone comes off really stern and because you don't interact with that person very often, you don't know that that's not their normal behavior. So now you're thinking that this boss from this department or this person from this department is a really stern person. And you're like, I wouldn't want to work with them, because now you've attributed their sternness as a part of their personality instead of understanding that maybe that department is under pressure. Maybe that person has 1,000 different things going on in their work life, and maybe their mom's sick and they've got kids who are crying at home and they can't find a babysitter and they just haven't had a break in so long. Like, so the point is that in that case, in that work case, we're thinking that this person is like a stone cold whatever word for that person, right? Because in a meeting they might have come off very stern. When in reality, if you were to meet them outside of a meeting, if you were to talk to them one-on-one, maybe they're a kitten, like they're the sweetest person ever. But we wouldn't know that most of the time, because when we have those attribution errors and we're saying in our heads, this person is this, and saying that's their personality, we've now biased ourselves to them. How could this come out with ourselves, right? So a really great example, especially with holiday seasons, is, have you ever had that moment, whether you have a dog or you have kids or you have younger siblings, or you have a whole bunch coming at you, and someone like a dog or a child or a younger sibling comes up to you and they want your attention, and there's so much going on and they go, please, and you're just like, stop, right? You're just very firm, or maybe you yell or a behavior comes out, where it is out of left field for you. Maybe you're a really calm person, or maybe you're a really understanding person, or maybe you're starting to get kind of judgy of people. And normally that's not who you are, right? The reason that, and I know from experience, so I love my dog. He's in here actually laying in his little bed, and he looked up at me because I was talking about him. But he can be very loud, and when he barks, he's a smaller dog, not a Chihuahua, he's a Yorkie. But he can be really loud. And so if I'm hyper stimulated by everything going on, and then he starts to bark at a squirrel in the yard, I might be like, yeah, stop, right? Traditionally, if he's barking at a squirrel in the yard, I might honestly laugh, because I think it's funny that he's so upset about the squirrel who doesn't have like the comfort and safety of home that Yub has. But in that moment, in that situation, my survival mechanisms of I'm overstimulated, I gotta be firm, and it might come out, right? And then after that interaction with my dog, who is so sweet, and I love him, and he's amazing, and he's the best cuddle buddy and the biggest nerd, right? I'm gonna feel guilt and shame and remorse inside, because honestly, he probably doesn't care that much. He's gonna be like, okay, all right, I'll stop, right? But to me, I would be like, oh, I was a little bit more firm, a little bit more demeaning than I normally would have been. I wouldn't necessarily even like cuss at my dog, but I would potentially just be a firm voice in a way where I know he knows you better stop, but in a way where I'm feeling like, okay, that might have been an over exaggeration for what the situation called for. And so I would carry guilt for that, right? Because I shouldn't have reacted that way. I'm the human, he's the dog. I have a nephew, so if my nephew was to come up with me, and I might be like, dude, stop, right? Like, I might feel some guilt because, again, he's just a little kid. He's like 2-3 years old. He doesn't understand all the complexities of what's going on around us, or how I'm feeling internally, my internal state. Another example of attribution error comes when we're thinking about media, actually. So We often watch people playing roles, whether it's through YouTube videos where they're a persona of themselves, or podcasts, or movies or TV shows where people are legitimately playing characters that might not be anything like who they actually are. And we attribute those characteristics to those actors or those people, to varying degrees, right? So if you're watching someone on YouTube and it's more of a homegrown kind of channel, they're, just trying to live their best life and share their talents, then maybe you're getting a piece, or the watcher's getting a piece of who they inherently are. So it's not a full-on error, right? It's just, we might think that that's who they are all the time, and maybe that's just a piece of their personality, which isn't necessarily an error. But when we're watching, especially acting or fictitious characters being played, or even biographical characters played by someone else, the person might have absolutely nothing in common with the character that they're playing. But if the audience walks away thinking, oh, that actor is so much like that character, right? In their heads, they've now coupled, and this is through no fault of their own, they've now coupled that personality with the actor. And if they were to see that actor down the street, they would think that they know them and that they behave this way. Well, that's an attribution error, right? Because the actor was playing out in a situation. It was a role. This could happen with wrestling too, because they basically play characters, right? There's this role playing, and who they are outside of that is very different. So it's a mismatch of our connection between a person and a situational behavior. Now, guilt and shame, going back to kind of like that over stimulus example, we have moments in our lives, especially in childhood, because as more and more research has kind of showed, we take on a lot of baggage from childhood, right? And some of it is just errors in our perspective, because we're children, we don't understand the world, right? So as we grow, we can carry sometimes, we might have experienced errors in judgment according to what transpired, right? So for me, I know an early childhood memory that I had was that you can ask my parents, well, you're not going to ask my parents, but someone could ask my parents, and they would tell you that I cried a lot as a baby. Well, like, I was either a year or less than a year, and they found out I was lactose intolerant. My mom had been drinking a lot of lactose that can leach into the breast milk, and so I was perpetually sick, and the only way as a baby I could try to like say something's wrong was by crying. And it took an accident of being fed dairy and getting very sick at a young age for them to really understand, oh, this is the problem, right? As a baby, my brain, which was forming at the time, the right part of my brain was very dominant and developing, didn't understand didn't understand why my cries weren't being met, didn't understand why I kept being given something that was making me sick. And so down the road, that led to issues within my own self and my own body, where I would feed myself food that I really didn't like, or that didn't make my body feel good. And so there was an error in my developmental thinking of what I should be eating, and also my needs getting met and all of that stuff, right? We have moments of that in our childhood. You could say that what my baby brain might have taken away from that was actually an attribution error, which is that my parents don't meet my needs. We can form those sort of, or that caregivers don't, aren't trustable or aren't reliable or whatever. We form those kinds of safety and attachment understandings at a very, very young age. And it can mess with our later relationships. If we're lucky, we do some processing. We kind of figure out, okay, where am I feeling like this, is going on? Some people report that they have attachment issues because they went to kindergarten, that they were at home with their parent whichever one for a really long time. And when they got dropped off at kindergarten, it made them feel like they weren't loved. I don't. Anyway, and so they had attached to that an attribute of their parent didn't love them, when in reality, if you looked at the situation, it's very normal for kids to go to school at a certain point and for them to start to socialize and to be away from their parents, right? So sometimes we have these things lurking in our subconscious. And back to kind of like that Christmas time example, or if you have a kid, and it might not even be the holiday season, it could just be in general. If you have a kid or a dog or nieces or nephews, or you work with kids, or anyone who you kind of know you're in a position of authority but also responsibility for, right? We might have those feelings of guilt and shame when, due to the world or situations, we act in a way we know is out of alignment with ourselves. And if you're a really caring, loving person, I doubt that I'm going to get a whole lot of narcissists watching this video, but generally, like, everyone's on a spectrum of kindness, caring, and compassion. And so if you're one of those people who would say, you know, in general, I try to be this really loving, caring person, but I feel like sometimes I fall so short, and there are these moments where this is what's happening, it's probably because you're not giving yourself the grace of life happens, and sometimes our survival mechanisms, which I'll talk about in another video, pop up. And we say or do things that it is out of alignment with who we really are, or our character, or our general personality, because we've just been pushed to the point of, right? So how do we deal with that? Well, I think that one of the main ways we can deal with that is, one, letting go of old shame and guilt. So a lot of us hold on to shame and guilt and attribution errors about ourselves, where we've chalked up moments in time, those bad moments where we did something that we feel really, really terrible about. And if you were to tell pretty much anyone else, they'd probably look at you and go, you really think you're terrible for that? Like, who did you actually hurt? But we hold on to those moments that are so different from our character that create those feelings of guilt and shame, and they go way past their expiration date. So there is something to be said for the importance of remorse when we act in a way that is unsafe, unhealthy, negatively impacts a broad spectrum, or ourselves, or broad spectrum of other people, ourselves. So I'm not saying that there is not a point where we should reflect. We should reflect upon our actions, and if we really feel like, oh, that time that I got stern with Yub, that was so inappropriate, I don't like, I have to process that, and I have to think about, and this is what's really important, and where I think the guilt and shame from attribution errors and situational just experiences pop up. We have to look at that and say, okay, did I spread myself too thin? Did I kind of freak out a little bit because maybe I had spent, 2 weekends with family, and I didn't take any time to myself, and I didn't really paint, and I, all of these things that would traditionally help me self-regulate my nervous system, did I just throw out the window? And was that the reason for the lead up to the behavior that I now am feeling bad about? And if so, then I know to negate that from happening further, because that was a behavior that is undesirable to me, I need to incorporate behaviors that allow me to feel in alignment with, that allow me to feel like my behavior is in alignment with my truest self, right? So, and that's, and then I can let it go. And it is important at that point to obviously, if it's my dog, I would have said, yes, I'm really sorry. Mommy was stressed. I love you. Maybe given him an extra homemade treat or something. But, but we do at some point, you atone whatever that means for the situation. If it's with a kid, you might sit them down and, have a frank discussion where you go, buddy, I am so sorry. You didn't do anything. mommy or daddy or auntie or uncle was really frustrated in the moment, felt uncomfortable, and I unfortunately took it out in this way that wasn't appropriate. Sometimes when grown-ups get exasperated or when grown-ups have too much stress on their plates, they don't always realize it, and then they act out in a way that hurts others. And I'm going to do better not to do that. Like, you can have those discussions. That's really important, to have that follow-up. In a workplace, I think that currently culture kind of says, don't admit you're wrong, right? If you're the boss and you do something, you have to be strong and just, that's not healthy. So I would suggest, and this is from a psych perspective, if you're a boss and you're in a sector where it's possible, if you have a day and you know that maybe the way that you treated employees or an employee wasn't in alignment with who you are or who you want to be, and you've just got a lot going on, one, if you can, take a day off, which I know is easier said than done, to reflect, get your stuff together, and then figure that out. And two, if it really was harmful, I highly suggest having just a frank conversation with the employee saying, hey, I know during this meeting a couple of days ago, I got kind of firm and heated. This is the pressure that I'm feeling from above. I want you to be aware of what we're working under and what's going on. And yes, there's got to be some discretion there, especially depending on your position. So I'm not saying don't use discretion in how much you share, because the further up you are, the more you do have to think about, okay, what's your overall employee morale and how much can you share about what might be going on? I get that. But taking responsibility for our actions, especially when we know that our actions weren't the best, that is a sign of being a leader, because it means that you're willing to reflect upon yourself, and a good leader reflects upon themselves. So in a workplace setting, I would also say, if you make a mistake, own up to it. The conversation might be very different than if you're having a conversation with a spouse, with a friend, with a child, with a dog, with a nephew, with whatever, with a child. It's going to be different, but it builds trust, and it allows the person to see the other person, who might have been the individual who's going to now have a different perspective of you. It allows them to better understand you, right? It allows them to have a better mental model of who you are and how you behave. And the next time that you might be very stressed, and this could be with a partner, especially someone, a contemporary, a friend, or at work, when we get vulnerable and we open up about, and granted, this is if you're in a safe environment. So if you've surrounded yourself with narcissistic personalities that take advantage of any weakness, that's a whole nother story. But in general, I really do believe that most people care, and they want more. They want to be understanding. It's just how much we share really determines how understanding we can be. And so if you're in that position, when you share what's going on, your frame of reference, your point of view, more about the situation, it can often negate those attribution errors, right? Because if you go to someone and you say, I realized that I had this tone, or I realized that this happened, for point of reference, it's not an excuse. This is the pressure that we're under. This is what needs to be. And then while they'll know, well, when they're frustrated, they get firm. They'll know that it's when you're frustrated, or they'll know that it's when there's a lot of stress going on with the company. So then they can kind of anticipate, oh, I know this is going on. This might be what comes out. It allows for a broader understanding of our conditions as humans, because we're not one-dimensional or even two-dimensional. We're like quadruple, we're multi-dimensional in so many ways. So the better we can assist people by giving them a fuller point of reference of who we are as a person, if they're open to that, the easier it is for us to coexist with one another and really show up for one another and for ourselves. So I would highly suggest having those conversations, and having those conversations with yourself first. So I would say it's better to sit down, really think about your behavior before going to someone and saying, oh, this happened and I'm so sorry. Not that you shouldn't do that, you should, but I think it's important for us to understand our own reasons behind our behaviors before we try to have a conversation with someone else. Because unless it's a therapist or a really good friend where you're like, I want to talk to you because I did this and I'm trying to understand why I did it. And then the intention has been set that you're trying to understand your own behavior, and that's okay too. Anyway, so shame, guilt, attribution error. I hope that kind of makes sense, because I think that we hold on to these behaviors. We hold on to the worst moments in our lives sometimes as examples for who we are. And really, those are examples of our behaviors. And those are examples of some of the behaviors of others. But we all change, hopefully. And if you feel like you're surrounded in life by people who you can't have those kinds of conversations with, you can't, if you acknowledge weakness, you're going to get taken advantage of. If those are the kinds of situations that you're in, or if you feel like you can't be yourself, because if you are, no one's going to accept you, or at least the people that are currently surrounding you wouldn't accept you. This is a hard talk, but either they're going to accept you or they're not. And if they don't accept you, I guarantee that there are people who will, because there are people who accept a lot of different things. Whether I agree with it or not is not relevant, but there's a social group for pretty much anyone who wants one out there nowadays, especially with technology. Now, the degree to which that's fulfilling and actually brings happiness, that's a whole nother discussion, because there are varying degrees of social fulfillment that happen depending on how you're engaging. But if you feel like you're in a workplace where you really couldn't have that conversation, if you feel like you're in a family where you can't have that conversation, if you feel like you're in a headspace where with yourself you're unable to have that conversation, please get a therapist or a counselor, or seek help from someone, or go to a support group. If you grew up in dysfunction, or with addiction, or if you have an addiction, there are so many support groups out there. Or if you have trauma, there's trauma for that too. I was sexually abused as a kid, and there's a support group for that particular type of abuse. So you name it, there's probably something out there. But find a community where you can unpack some of the stuff that keeps you from feeling comfortable seeing where you might not be so bad, where there might have just been instances, and those instances created behaviors that aren't your personality. They're behaviors that are expressed when there's trauma and anxiety. And it can be scary when we start to embark on that kind of a journey, because sometimes the people that were in our lives, they fall away because we realize, when we're actually acting out of ourselves, when we're actually understanding who we are, when we're actually digging into our personality instead of living in a guilt, shame-based personality, we're not who we thought we were. That's okay. That's normal. It's all right. I think the world would be a lot happier if we all just allowed ourselves to be and allowed other people to be. But I can only do so much when it comes to that. So the point is, if you're feeling like you're misunderstood, if you're feeling like the persona that people see isn't who you really are, if you're feeling like the moments, or if you're feeling like the people around you, you're feeling unsafe with them, I would get, again, mental help of some kind, whether it's group support or individualized support. Guilt and shame and reliving our worst moments, however you might categorize yours, it takes up so much mental space. And also holding on to other people's worst moments as who they are takes up so much of our own mental space, because then we're only seeing others for their worst moments. And that's really what a fundamental attribution error, or that's really what an attribution error is at its core. Now, sometimes it can happen in reverse, where you might have someone who is actually very abusive and very toxic, but every once in a while, and this happens with abusive relationships, which can happen in the workplace or at home, so get that straight, but that can happen where you have someone who consistently is actually very toxic, where consistently their personality would say this is an unsafe person, but every once in a while they display an act of kindness, or they give you a morsel of affection, and that's what keeps people, especially kind of victim personalities, entangled with perpetrator personalities. And people who are on either one of those personalities can change and grow, and they realize the toxic behaviors that led them to think that their behaviors were normal. So I'm not blaming anyone here, but it could be that you're dealing with the opposite situation, where it's not so much that you see the bad in people. Maybe it's that you're always trying to see the good in people, and then you don't leave situations that are fundamentally unhealthy because of those moments, those crumbs of positive attributes, right? And that's just as toxic as only seeing the bad in people, because it doesn't hold the people who are behaving in a way that truly is toxic responsible. It's giving them a pass. And we shouldn't give passes per se. We all should learn to be accountable for ourselves. I know I'm kind of like in a perfect world, but the point is, attribution can go either way, or attribution error can go either way, where we could attribute incorrectly that someone is a lot nicer than they actually are. We could attribute that someone is a lot meaner than they actually are, or that a particular behavior is really dominant in someone when maybe it's just a survival mechanism due to the situation. Or we might think that someone is a lot kinder, more courageous, or this or that than they actually are, because we've seen them in a position. And this doesn't just have to be like large scale celebrity. Sometimes that happens in communities. We see communities and workplaces and other things shattered when we think that someone, we've watched someone's persona from afar. So you could have local community leaders, but then the reality sinks in when people come out and say, well, actually this person tried to, assault me, or actually this person has had multiple cases of abuse at home, or actually, so that's kind of like the other side of what can happen, where we attribute the persona to the person, and really that's just a persona, and we're not seeing the person because they're busy trying to fulfill a role. And that's toxic on both ends, right? Because the person is never actually able to be themselves, or when they are themselves, they are constantly getting passes for their behavior, or there's pressure for that behavior not to come out. There's a fear of getting help to actually change the behavior, because what will people think? Those are very complicated situations. And honestly, anytime you're dealing with shame, guilt, and attribution errors, they're complex situations. And that's why it's important that we as individuals reflect on our own behaviors, and also that we really try to understand what we're seeing in other people's behaviors. And one important thing to note for anyone who's interested, it takes 4 to 7 positive behaviors to negate a negative interaction. So 4 to 7 positive interactions to negate a perceived negative interaction. Now, for people who are used to constant exposure to negative interactions and very rarely had a positive interaction, that might be skewed a little bit, and we might think that what we deserve is to be treated poorly, and so when someone treats us just average, we think that that's amazing. And that's a lot based on conditioning and what we're raised to believe our value is, and not just what we're raised to believe our value is, but what we end up seeing our value as. But all of these things can create errors in the reality, and I use that word loosely, the reality of the interactions we're having. If it feels unsafe, don't do it. If a person feels unsafe, walk away. But I do think that we tend to carry, and by we, I'm guessing anyone who's watching this, or most of the people who would watch this, you're probably pretty sensitive people. I know I am, where I'm the first person to blame myself. I'm the first person in an interaction who's going to take a step back and figure out what was my part in this, and how do I adjust so that I am able to create a sphere of welcomeness and healthiness, which is what it is. That's pretty subjective, pretty broad, but I think most people are anyone who's probably drawn to this is more the person who's attributing falsely negative characteristics to themselves because of moments where a survival mechanism might have come out. Maybe it's withdrawal, maybe it's aggression, who knows? But it's important to acknowledge those moments. Don't just, they don't matter, right? Acknowledge those moments, digest them, and understand that it doesn't make you a bad person necessarily, and that it's important to debrief and deal with the situation. And also, if we're interacting with other people, the more we attribute those things and we kind of let them fester in ourselves, the more likely we are to do that to other people, because how we treat ourselves is often a reflection of how we treat other people, at least internally. So if we can't forgive ourselves and process our own behavior, then we're constantly probably seeing similar ways of judging other people, because we're going to judge other people pretty harshly when we judge ourselves pretty harshly. So I think it's just important to take a minute to understand how we perceive others, and to understand that our brains do sometimes try to project out. They create mental models. They try to understand the world around us based on sometimes few instances of interactions, and sometimes no direct interactions at all. And then that becomes what we think of people and who they are. And we're so much more than that. So we should give ourselves and other people some grace in the room to really be themselves, by understanding that one instance doesn't make a pattern, and that there needs to be some perspective on that. So first, perspective on ourselves and others. So hopefully that's helpful. I know that this is probably a weird format, because I like paint and then I look and I paint and I look and I talk. But I think sometimes it can be relaxing, and also it's more conversational this way, because guilt and shame are heavy topics. There are a lot of reasons why we can feel guilt and shame. And attribution error is, it's really common, I think. It's a pretty common human thing that we do. And it's something that doesn't get discussed as often as it probably should. So hopefully this was helpful. If you did create something, that's great. If you were able to channel some feelings of guilt and shame, I don't think this is really a guilt-shame painting. This really is more of a rainbow painting, probably just how my chakras are feeling today. But if you were able to channel out or journal out, or if some instances of guilt and shame from your past where you just went, oh, I did that the other day to my kid and I guess I did feel a bit of this, or oh, I yelled at the dog the other day and I did feel this, like, journal it out, paint it out, doodle it out. If you watch through this video, it's a long video, so maybe you did it during the video, maybe you just listened while you were doing something else. I listen to videos a lot when I'm at the gym, but feel free to take some time at some point to creatively process or physically process, whatever your method is, out those feelings that might have come up when you're going, oh, as a boss I did this, or as an employee I did this, as a sibling I did it. We all have our moments, and the more we can uncouple those and unpack them, the more we can understand what really drives us to get to the point of those survival instincts coming out, the less we're going to have them come out, because we can preemptively try to put into place the guardrails, the coping mechanisms, the day in, day out ritual strategies, whether it's you meditate 5 minutes every morning or you work out a half an hour, whatever it is that helps you kind of self-regulate, we can put those in play once we identify that this is a common theme, or this is something that really does affect me, or this is something that really does help me cope. But if we don't look at those things, then we can't do that. So hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for watching. Guilt, shame, attribution error. I'll do a video at some point where I just talk through like the survival response, because that is a part of some of why we might feel the way that we feel. And I might tackle a video about the love response too at some point, because they're like counter to each other. Anyway, thank you for painting or doodling or creating with me. If not, thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and you process, because I know I will. Bye.